Oh, another draft physics video presentation. Yes. That's how we'll start anyway. Okay, let's see how we finish. Maybe some other kind of video. Who knows? So anyway, some comments and then on to Professor. Whatever his name is. Anyway, Sherry Silverfox. So right away you're just saying, yeah, you think so. Anyway, thank you for sharing your lack of knowledge with the world. Okay, again, something that could be typed on any video on Earth. Don't overwork that last brain cell in your head. Again, something that could be typed on any video in the world. Very original of you. It is so lonely. Do yourself a favy, something like that. Read a fucking book, you ignorant fucktard. So, I wonder where she got fucktard. Yeah, plagiarism. Anyway, I remember the origin. I was sort of there. I didn't invent it. But anyway, just this, you just wonder what kind of book she reads, or he, This could just be some racist who, does the, pretends to be black people and be stupid just to do their racist thing. But anyway, go back to the 80s, you stoner metalhead. So that just doesn't seem very, like something a person of color would waste their time on, I mean, that does sound like some resentful, fat, white guy, some Trumper. So anyway, let's, so this is on a video where I'm ragging on Tesla, the god of bullshit. And all the videos are, her favorite videos are all truther crap and, forbidden archaeology, the wisdom of the dead, kind of bullshit. Any kind of hocus pocus bullshit. And this is somebody who, again, throws stones, and living in such a glass house. I just find it bizarre, ironic, all that kind of stuff. Well, that's not what I want. So I have to move this? Oh, that's irritating. I have to do some work. But just so stupid. I mean, just so fucking stupid. I mean, people can't make a single reasoned argument why your view of the world is right. You can't defend your own crap, and you can't even attack somebody else with anything original. Like I have 80s hair? No, I have 60s hair, if you want to, label it with a decade. But regardless, it's like an American Indian. So if I had black hair and I look like an American Indian, I had a few other, facial features, you'd say go back to to the Indian. What is this? I mean, how retarded can you get? Just is that what you're trying to do? Just see how stupid can I appear? Like I said, I'd almost think it's somebody pretending. Just part of the fake news world that exists. Mostly made up by the people claiming fake news as the problem. But just pitiful. Try again. Maybe. Or not. So Dove, I'm drunk. Don't give a fuck. Love you. Happy New Year from Australia. Well, that's nice. Australia seems to have some reasonable people in it. Seems to. Maybe. Possibly. A few. Had too many. Time to sleep. Yes. Well, drinking just doesn't get you anywhere. If I'm going to give you like old man advice, it's the drug of morons, really. I mean, come on. There's so many better ways to fuck your head up than drinking. It just makes you stupid. I mean, it's true. It does make you stupid. It's like, you almost forget how to walk. I mean, it's really just not a great drug. Sorry. Just, you got to choose better if you must. And I would just, as advice, just say that, it really doesn't solve any problems because, you know, it sort of creates just as many as it solves, even when you find a good drug. And you're just better off figuring out how to do it without it. You know, eat an apple or something. You know, try to muddle through. You know, but whatever. Don't take my advice. I don't care. Just saying. From some experience, you're better off without it. It's just trouble. So, really don't need these kind of comments, so I will remove it. It's really not on the subject. All right, thinking clearly too. DraftScience, sorry I was having a bad day. You don't have to apologize. I mean, really. You know, I was cranky also. So, you know, I basically said that, and, you know, it's not a big deal. I'd like to throw some shit in my face. Yeah, I understand. It's, you know, but it's not your fault. It's not your fault either, so yeah, it's okay. Apologies. You don't really have to apologize for the whiny crap. Like I said, you don't owe me anything. I don't think I owe you anything. You know, doing our best. Just a lot of head fuck going back to work next week. Yeah, I empathize. Sympathize, let's put it that way. Nerves feeling a bit raw, yes. I didn't want to think about it. A moment of weakness on my part. Again, sorry. I don't think it's, you know, like I said, you don't owe me anything. You know, just don't persecute me. Yeah, that's all. I'm not trying to make it worse for you. I'm not picking on you. Really, I'm not. Just kind of defending myself. You know, sometimes I do it aggressively. So, sorry. Also. But, yeah. Yeah, okay. Enough said. Alright, so, no comments of any real substance, so we'll go on to the regularly scheduled broadcast day of physics. Yay! But it's not very good physics. Boo. So, anyway, let's try. Maybe I'll just do a preface. Yeah, what the hell. I will talk a little bit about the complexities of the circumstance. Alright, so these are sort of things we know, but they don't know. Okay, is that light is not a small thing, but kind of a big thing. The quanta appears to be very small, but so I don't know exactly how to draw this, so I'm just going to illustrate a photon as a thing. So if you want to think it's a wave, it's okay. I don't care how you think about it. And the point is atoms are much smaller than the dimensionality of what ends up being a photon. So a photon has dimension. Whoops. Okay. It has dimension this away, and it has a frequency this way. Okay, and these are two elements of its reality. And atoms, this thing is big, so there's thousands of atoms, okay, that would encompass the width of this thing. Now their theory is that these atoms are made of this point particle, they call it an electron, and, you know, a nucleus. And they think this point particle is actually a nothing. Like it has no volume, you know, that it's got no spatial dimensions. And somehow this big giant thing hits this little tiny thing. So even when they do it as a wave, you know, the wave has to somehow irritate this little tiny thing. Okay, even though the wave is much bigger, like, you know, this is so out of proportion. I mean, this point thingy is part of something that's 2,000 times smaller than this thing. And yet this thing's even, you know, a tiny speck in that 1/2000th. It's like 2 million times smaller than the 2000 thing. It's so tiny. And somehow this wave is conveying some sort of vibration, okay? And that's when this wave gets killed. Okay, so if the wave vibrates this little electron, then the wave stops existing, and this vibration is now the wave. So somehow this big giant wave somehow goes right across this little point thingy. Somehow the little point thingy knows how to vibrate the length of this ray. We don't even have a conversation about that. But this matter is moving, we know, and as this wave is going through. So this point particle isn't even in the same spot while this wave is going by and somehow causing this jiggle thing, okay, for which we don't have any explanation for how it jiggles, like what causes it to go this way, and then what causes it to go that way, and then what causes it to go this way again, and what causes it to go that way again. There's nothing simple about this jiggle idea. There's no forces involved that we understand, that anybody can explain, like how it knows it's got to stop and go back the other way, and then stop and then go back the other way. No explanations for any of that. So anyway, I would argue, okay, and then that's on top of the fact that they think this little nothing, this thing that has no volume, I mean no, like I can't draw it to size or scale because it doesn't have any size, it literally to them doesn't have a size. And somehow this thing interacts with it, even though it doesn't exist, essentially, right? They just basically said it doesn't exist. So how can that possibly make sense to anybody? I mean, it can't make sense to me. But on top of that, top of all those things, they think it's zooming around the atom at some preposterous speed. So it's doing all this jiggling thing while it's moving at this preposterously fast speed, going around some nucleon-y thing, protons and neutrons, and yet it's coherently being conveyed through a substance. I don't understand how this is a credible explanation to anybody. It just seems totally incredible, and just all made out of stuff for which there's no answers. I mean, there's more unanswered questions than answered questions, in my opinion. So I would argue that atoms don't do any of that, that the atom does have a plus nucleus and that it does have a minus charged particle, but that they're in rigid positions. So when they share an electron, they literally share it. I mean, it's shared. It's in one place. It's connecting this atom to this atom, and they're both using it in the sense that they're magnetically connected to it. So they're attached by that mechanism. And if they could have even a deeper attachment deeper into a shell of another electron and make even a stronger bond, or they could bond with more than one, in more than one position, be sharing more than one electron and create even stronger bonds. But anyway, that's the connections. There's all this stuff is not zooming around, that it's in sort of a semi-rigid positions, and it might be vibrating a little because there's force pushing between the electrons, little bits, and there's an absence of pressure between the proton and the electron, and this electron is, I've sort of explained all this, but this electron really can't move in because then it gets closer to these other two electrons. All of those kind of dynamics exist in there somewhere, but it's a rigid machinery, and what we're really talking about is photons convey their energy to these electrons. The electrons move their position, and there's position changes you can make that will cause other electrons to move their position, and then their position, and then their position, and that you can cause a cascade, much like sound, in the sense that the vibration, the movement, is just a bunch of stuff pushing on each other. You change one thing, that change is conveyed to all the other things. All right. So, I'm saying to me that's a more realistic, workable model, that there's a real thing you're hitting. It's not a point particle thing. It's not such a minute amount of space that you can't even imagine how it could be possible to even hit it. It has to be pretty hittable because things hit it. The stuff does get, there are reactions. All right, so the point is that there's different kinds of reactions. So we'll just call this a surface. And so photons can come in and they can reflect. Now, I would argue that the reflection has to be made out of this polarization. So this is a piece of the photon, this is a piece, this is a piece, and those are all spread over different areas. Okay, they're all coming in, and they're going to hit different electrons on different atoms, and then they have to, somehow recombine in the sense that the right proportion or right amount of them come back out and create light that you might see as a reflection. And then the other part of what the light is doing, okay, is the other thing it can do is do the transmission thing. So somehow the energy of the photon, goes in, and it is conveyed to the other side of the material in some reasonable form where, again, it's put together in the right order, and then the bits come out, okay, in the right order to create a visible photon, with the right frequency. And then the other part is dispersed, where the energy goes in, the photon goes in, but it goes in such a way that it creates a disturbance that ends up just heating the material. That is, it knocks the electron so hard, or pushes it so far, that it ends up being a little bit of electron. It creates like an ion, and the ion bit flies around, hits other atoms or other electrons, moves them around, and so you end up with this heat, and you can get rid of that as infrared radiation, pretty much, to the atmosphere, or you can actually just vibrate other atoms in the atmosphere to get rid of the motion. So so you have transmission, you have reflection, and then you have this kind of dispersion. Now dispersion can also create light, so you can just have it so the material itself doesn't do this consistent thing anymore, and so the light ends up going in too many directions, and it loses its coherency and ends up coming out in different locations because it doesn't have a clean path from the surface to surface. Alright, so we know about glass especially that you can polish this surface. That is, you can make this gap smaller and smaller, by just polishing the surface, and that you'll go through what appear to be kind of layers where you'll have 0 reflection all the way up to 16% reflection. So there's this idea that when you're polishing this surface, that what you're actually doing is changing the atoms on the surface, because now the atoms are in such a position where at one moment it's 16% being reflected, and then polish a little bit more and you're down to 0% reflection. Now it's only true for light coming in straight. Okay, I mean, as you change the angle, you increase the likelihood of reflection, but the reflective index, which is the tendency of the light to reflect, remains the same. Now the other fact that you have to deal with is this idea that this energy that goes through this transmission ends up being a little bit deflected, that it comes in and it changes the angle a little bit, and then the angle when it comes back out again is restored to the original angle. And so that's another complexity that has to be explained. That has to be part of a theory if you're going to explain. Oh, you can't see any of that. Well, there wasn't much to see over there, but yeah, there you can see it real quick, and then I'll leave it. Yeah, okay. It's good enough, right? Yeah, that's good enough. Sorry, I just got to remember not to go that far. Alright, so their theory is, then I'm not saying it's entirely wrong, I'm just saying parts of it don't make much sense. So another trick you have with regular glass, anyway, the kind of regular glass, is that this frequency, it's pretty frequency dependent. So the idea is that the atom has these orbitals in it, where you can change where the electron is. It's either a 1 or a 2, let's say. Just the argument with glass is there's actually a 3 out here, and the idea is you have to get the 1 all the way to the 3 because there's no room in number 2. Oh, I don't know. It's almost on the screen, but anyway. So the complexity here becomes, well, these electrons can be here or over here. The idea would be is that you're pushing it in, that you push it into this closer orbit, or you push it out of the closer orbit. Okay, But how do you exactly do that? Because obviously if the photon were a bit of energy and it did hit an electron, you could say, okay, yeah, it pushes it in from this side, but it pushes it out if it hits it over here. You know, if it hits one over here, it's going to end up pushing it out, not in. And so that doesn't seem like that provides a consistent mechanism, because half the time it would be moving them into wider orbits, and then half the time it'd be moving them into inner orbits, which indicates to me that it doesn't matter in or out. It's the change that matters, not whether you go in or out. As soon as you put another electron in, okay, as soon as you change an orbit, you've changed its pressure. So when they say these orbitals have, you know, like the interior one is a, 5 million electron volts or something, they'll say, yeah, in here it's, this is the weak one. This is only 1 electron volt or something, And then out here, this is like 10,000 electron volts or something. Some idea that there's more energy depending on which location you're in. And I would argue, no, there's more energy when you move something from one location to another location, because now you've, say there was 4 things here, there was 4 electrons in here, and then you shove number 5 in here. You could sort of understand that that's going to increase the pressure between all these electrons, because now they have another player in here for more interactions. So now there's going to be more bounces here and more bounces here, and that's going to be more pressure on all the other electrons, so they're all going to move their positions and to accommodate that higher pressure. And if there's other electrons out here, they obviously can't move out too easily without pushing on all these electrons. And so I think that's a more so, and if you moved someone out, you're doing the same thing. You're changing the pressure out here. So if you move them out here, you have the same problem where you got, where you might have had 8 electrons, now you got 9 electrons, and so it's going to increase the pressure in that orbit. So it wouldn't matter whether you're going in or out. It just matters that you're displacing an electron, putting it someplace where you're going to make a crowd. So wherever you push it, it gets crowded, is the point. And I think that's probably, I'm not saying that's the truth. I'm just saying I think it's a more viable explanation of how that functions. So anyway, their theory is something like this. If I was to summarize it and fix it a little bit, okay, because they haven't really said. So a reflection, in my opinion, has to be something that, it just happens pretty much on the surface. The electron is hit by the piece of energy. The electron moves out and then moves back in, okay, and that's the release of the reflection energy. Now, when it does that, it's also releasing one back this way, but we're not going to talk about that because, nobody's done an experiment to find that one. That's real energy conservation, in the sense that I'm arguing that the energy is really an exchange, that energy goes in and energy always comes back out. But anyway, not important. And the point is it would be always dispersed, because these angles might not be perfect, these reflections might not be perfect, so we never see them anyway, because each element will hit a different electron, and the angle won't be perfect, so you'll never reconstruct this returning photon. You'll only return energy that you can't see, like gravity. But anyway, I don't want to see. There's a lot of nuance. It's the mechanism is simple, right? Nobody has it nailed as we've got it all proven. So we're all stuck just trying to model what the mechanism is. So the idea is, okay, the reflection is just happening on the surface electrons. And you can imagine that the surface is where the electrons are, because they're on the outside of the atom. So when you put a bunch of atoms together, there's going to be electrons on the surface. That should be a given. And that reflections are happening on the surface, and maybe they go in a little deeper and hit an electron here, and the same kind of thing happens and it reflects out. But it can't be too deep, because then you break the phase of the electron. Then you can't reconstruct the electron, because these path differences will be too high again. You'll be stuck with too high a path difference and broken photon. All right, and then so the transmission thing is the part that's all that's frequency dependent. And so the real point I've made, if you want to knock something out of its orbit, I guess I'll redraw it. Okay, so we did reflection. And then we'll erase over here, and then we'll have more room. Sorry. Yeah, I don't know why the light's poor today, but it is. All right, so the argument for transmission, okay, would be something like so it's not going to be a reflection this time. So now you're coming in with a more than one bit. It's going to hit the electron. Now, the whole problem with that is how can more than one bit hit it, because the photon is gigantic. Well, the point is, though, is there's a lot of photons in that polarization space. There's lots of different photons, released subtly different times and ways, and they're all adding energy to the system. But the idea would be is that this electron gets hit by the piece of energy, but it doesn't it's not permanent. So again, like the reflection, the electron moves to a location and then moves back. Okay. But that won't work. Okay, because that won't be frequency dependent then. Well, yes, it does. It moves in and then it moves back out again. So that's the part I want to do. Okay, so reflection means the electron moves out and then moves back in. And a transmission would be the electron gets hit and it moves in and then moves back to its position. And if the frequency is high enough, though, what's going to happen is the electron, so that's the light that gets transmitted, is doing this thing and sending a little bit of energy to the next electron. And then that electron sends a little bit of energy to the next electron. So the electrons are moving, and that's why the light slows down. It's because the process requires the electron to move, and it's moving much slower than the energy. So when it takes time for it to go out, and it takes time for it to go back. The go back part is where it shoots the little bits at the next electron, and the next electron does the same thing, and so that's what slows down the movement, slows it down from getting to the other side. So let's just assume that one little bit hits. Now, if you shoot ultraviolet light or something, a much higher frequency light, well, then the electron actually moves more than the distance it can get back from. So it doesn't move to a location where it can get back, and instead moves right the hell out of the atom. And now it becomes heat. And now it'll bounce around inside the atom, do all that kind of stuff, and you'll never see it come out over here intact, because now it's lost inside of the material as a piece of loose bullet. So now the bullet's loose inside the material, and so essentially glass is opaque to ultraviolet light. So if I go high enough on the spectrum, frequency-wise, I'll block the transmission of the photon. It won't be able to transmit anymore, because now it is getting booted out of the system. So I guess what I wanted to say for the stuff that gets transmitted, yeah, the key would be is that does have sufficient energy to migrate the photon to another shell. Let me just think about that. Yeah, I think it has to be that way. But anyway, and then that pressure, that means that this gets pressurized. See, if you move it to the outer shell, or you put it in another shell, you end up creating an expansion of the atom. And now the atom itself essentially pushes on the other atoms, and they all push on each other. So it's a cascade of the pressure in the atom. Yeah, might be a better way to say it. So it's like you take an electron on the surface that's not part of the atom, that's just bound to the proton, and you essentially push that electron into an atom. And then when you push it into the atom expands. And as the atom expands, that means it's going to push on the neighboring atom that was comfortable. And now you made them uncomfortable, and they just keep pushing that expansion through to the next atom. And the atoms, because it's glass, It has a bunch of fissure lines, so to speak. It has lines of organization. The glass has some organization to it, and the idea would be is that I would argue that the protons and electrons have to be scattered, so that each row of atom ends up having, if these were protons, they would be staggered. That means the surface has got staggered electrons, and anyway, I don't want to get into that. It's a whole other argument. And such. Take a little break. Should have given myself more drawing room. Yeah, so it's more room in here now. Anyway, on to the video, and we'll reference the previous conversation where appropriate and such.
Welcome to Lecture Online. In order to understand photons better, we're going to now take a look at how X-rays are produced. After all, X-rays are photons as well. So, how do we produce X-rays? Well, what we do is we take, for example, a tube like this, we evacuate it, and we send electrons across at very high speeds from the cathode to the anode. We apply a very strong potential difference to give them a very large acceleration. So by the time the electrons reach the anode, where they impact on the target, they'll have energies of 60 to 80,000 electron volts. And so when they impact on the anode typically made either out of tungsten or molybdenum, and we'll see in just a moment why that is, then they'll produce X-rays. So X-rays will be produced.
Right. So the idea is to hit the metal with something more than photons, technically. And then X-rays are produced by the atoms degrading, essentially being broken, pieces broken off, and releasing high-frequency photons. Yeah, that's probably enough for now. So it just really has to do with the pressure. Again, as pointed out before, the frequency of what's getting released is really the frequency of what's bound. So when two electrons exist, there's this idea that their pressure is really made out of, you can just think of these as ping pong paddles, and there's a ball bouncing between them. And the closer I put them, the more interactions there's going to be, the more back and forth. And the idea is when you disrupt that by pulling one of the paddles out, that these things now are confined in as a certain bouncing rate, and that bouncing rate will be released to the universe. And so if they're further apart, it'll take longer for each bit to be thrown out as a little bit of energy. But if they're closer together, then you're going to get a closer bits of energy. Oh, I'm way out of bounds there. This away, okay. Yeah, now I'm not in the picture. Isn't terribly important, but I might as well try to be a little bit professional. So anyway, so that would be how I would explain where the frequency comes from. So something like tungsten is a very hard, well-bound atoms. So you can imagine that tungsten would have a lot of electrons that are very tight, lots of pressure between them, very close together. And what you're really just doing is knocking one out of position. By knocking it out of position, you're going to release the reflecting energy, and it's going to have a frequency that's going to be high because of the fact that the reflexing, the bouncing, be it back and forth, was at a higher rate. So the frequency is just a reflection of the substance and how how tightly bound the electrons are, and the fact that you're knocking them out of position and allowing energy to escape. Something like, again, you know, I don't have the hard model yet, but their model, again, is this idea of somehow you're vibrating something with some sort of something, and it's just a bunch of pointing to things that don't have any shape or substance. And, you know, it's just vapor as an explanation. The vapor made it happen. All right, this will have to go back over here.
From the impact of these electrons into the target, the anode. Now, the frequency of the X-rays and the wavelength of the X-rays will depend upon the metal itself. So what's going on here? Well, there's two kinds of radiation coming from this particular event. The first radiation is what we see in the shape of a black body curve, and this is what we call the bremsstrahlung. And what that means is Brem means breaking in German, and Strahling means radiation. This is what we call the breaking radiation that was discovered in this particular type of experiment. And so where that comes from is as electrons keep streaming in, they're going to be impacting the first layers of the anode, and they're going to be deflected by the nuclei of the atoms in the anode. As they're being deflected, they're going to be slowed down. As they slow down, they lose energy. That energy then will be radiated in the form of what we call bremsstrahlung, which is a form of X-ray radiation.
All right, so I would argue that no, what you're really doing is compressing things, and by compressing them, you're bringing them closer together. You're increasing the ping pong ball's vibration rate. So as you're introducing another electron into the systems, you're increasing the pressure between them, and you're doing so in a way that allows there to be escape. Some of it's going to get out, and it's going to get out because of the higher frequency. It's going to have a higher frequency when it leaves because it was bouncing back and forth in a confined space that was able to produce that frequency.
But that's only going to be a low intensity radiation, not what we need, for example, for medical purposes. Now, the reason why they have these anodes here that are made out of molybdenum or tungsten is because they have certain energy levels that if one of these electrons is able to come in and knock an electron out of the innermost energy level, then the next electron then will fall down and take its place. So, for example, let's say we have the nucleus right here. In the case of tungsten, I think
So let's understand, this whole orbiting model, okay, you have to think of that in this context, that this thing is spinning around at, 400,000 meters per second around this nucleus, and that somehow you're going to hit it and then knock it into a new orbit, and there's no explanation for how, that's a practical thing to be doing. If you're going to change its vector, so to speak, its balance in the system, you're more likely to cause it to leave than you are to cause it to change positions if they're moving.
I write it down here, right here. It has atomic number 74. Molybdenum has atomic number 42. So there would be 74 protons in the nucleus of tungsten. And so in the innermost energy level, if there's an electron there and another electron comes in and is able to knock this one out of orbit, or out of that orbital, I should say, should we call it an orbit, of course, then in the other level, the next level, an electron will fall down and take its place, and that causes a photon to be produced. The difference is that the energy...
So that's basically drawing the reflection backwards, right? I mean, you have to account for each bit. So he has one bit going in, hitting another bit. So he had this bit leaving, and this bit did what? Where did it go? So it doesn't really make much sense that there'd be a hole there, okay, unless you think both bits flew off. And then somehow the stuff from the other energy jumps in. So I'm just saying they don't have a clear. This isn't something they know for sure. This is just the story they're telling. It's a version of the truth, a version of a possible truth. And instead of qualifying it by saying, well, we're sort of guessing that this is the answer, they talk about it as if they know it's the answer.
The energy difference between these two levels is so high that it can be as much as 59.3 kilo electron volts or 67.2 kilo electron volts. There's two particular jumps that are peculiar to tungsten that will cause then a photon to be ejected.
So let's understand, when they say an electron volt or a kilovolt, all I have to do, is change how close something is, and they say that's more energy. When the reason why that's more energy is, again, in this tipping point argument, when you're trying to knock something that's already stuck to something and you have to hit it quickly or it goes back. So it's only a rebound effect. It's not an absolute definition of anything called real energy. It just means the capacity to disrupt electrons, which is only one form of energy, and it's not the absolute form
of those particular energies, and those energies then are associated with a wavelength of between 20 to 100 picometers, which is therefore an X-ray at 59.3 or 67.2 kilo electron volts. So it sends two beams of X-rays. This would be the predominant one, and that would then be the X-ray level or the X-ray energy produced in this particular X-ray machine. Now, for low dose X-rays or lower energy X-rays that have much lower energies, we use a metal called molybdenum because there the energy differences aren't as high. Notice there's only 42 protons in the nucleus, and so therefore it produces less energetic X-rays and less damaging to the body. These are typically used for mammograms. These are used for other kinds of things such as taking pictures of bones and things like that. So we do have different reasons for building.
So it's essentially the same thing you could argue as spectral lines. All right. So there's preferential amounts of pressure in atoms. You know, there's atoms have pressure in them, and you're likely to release the pressure that's pre-existing than to release some new pressure. So yes, you can interact and create almost any kind of photon. All right, that's part of that curve. You know, you'll create some ultraviolet, and you'll create some other different kinds. But the preferential one is when you really do evacuate one of these electrons or do something to disturb them in enough of a way where you release the pressure that's actually in the atom. And those are the preferential ones, the ones where a lot of photons of that particular frequency will be released. That's how I would state it.
Building different kinds of X-ray machines. Now, again, the interesting thing is here's two different kinds of X-rays that are produced. The first one is the bremsstrahlung. So what happens is, for example, an electron, instead of being in a head-on collision with another electron, it will go ahead and move past the nucleus, but because of the interaction between the electron and the nucleus, this electron will change direction. Therefore, there will be a deceleration. The deceleration causes some radiation then to be emitted, and that radiation will be in the form of an X-ray or a...
So that doesn't make much sense either, right? This decelerating by going in association with the proton, because that's one of those gravity arguments. You get as much as you lose. So if you're drawing gravity, and charge works the same way, you're gaining speed as you're moving towards the proton, and then you lose speed moving away from it because you're attracted. So if something goes into gravity and bends, it leaves the gravity well with the same speed it went in. It doesn't, there's energy conservation. So in a sense he's saying somehow it's not conservational. And the only way you can say that is that you have to also affect the proton in terms of moving the proton. Then you can make the argument. But you have to move the proton with the electron.
High energetic UV ray, and so most of them will of course bypass a collision with electrons, and therefore they will cause that bremsstrahlung radiation. The other kind of radiation is where an electron comes in, strikes one of these electrons, knocks them away from the orbital. The one in the next level will jump down, of course, they will all come kind of cascading down, filling out the empty spots, but there's the highest energy difference right here between energy level 2 and energy level 1 that will produce one of these two particular jumps. And so they'll produce a jump of 59.3 kilo electron volts or 67.2 kilo electron volts.
So I would argue that the jumping isn't the key. The key is the fact that you're changing the pressure in the system by interjecting another electron into the system, and you're getting the pressure back out.
Find out what wavelength of radiation that is. We can then, of course, go to this equation. We can say that the energy is equal to h times the frequency, which is h times the speed of light divided by the wavelength, or the wavelength is equal to hc divided by the energy. So
again, I'm just going to argue that it's just the wrong way to define energy. Clearly, energy in this circumstance, okay, is going to be associated with the fact that you're moving electrons in certain positions, but it's not an absolute definition of energy. Energy is the bullets. How fast you fire the bullets matters when you're trying to knock electrons loose from their tension, but it isn't the definition of the real energy.
Wavelength corresponds to this particular X-ray. All right, so we have 6.626 times 10 to the minus 34 for Planck's constant, that's joules times seconds, multiplied times 3 times 10 to the 8 meters per second for the speed of light, divided by 59,300 electron volts. And of course, we want to convert that to joules, which is 1.6 times 10 to the minus 19 joules per electron volt. And when we do all that...
Yeah, she'll get a number, and you know, I don't know if I should illustrate that again. I mean, just trying to emphasize this point that this is just not right. What do I have to do? I have to move the camera. Is what I have to do. Okay. See, what they're saying is I could take a piece of ultraviolet. Let's say, you know, just I could take a piece of a light that has a frequency. And by compressing the frequency, that is taking these four things, and making them closer together, that I've increased the energy of the photon. And I really haven't. I mean, it's still just 4 bullets. Okay, and the distances, like I said, becomes important when you're trying to push something out of tension. So something that's stuck somewhere, and it's glued a little bit, and it's a little sticky, and you have to hit it before it wobbles back, it comes back. And so again, you have to hit it fast to knock it out. And that's the rule. That's the only way this means anything. And what they're doing, okay, because they don't define how much energy is in the photon, the ray length doesn't mean anything to them. They don't have any math for that. They're basically saying that when I do this conversion, when I take this energy and I make it close together like this, what they're doing is adding a bunch. So they're saying in 1 second. Well, in 1 second, when you do this, when you start really compressing these little things, putting them closer and closer together, 1 second means that you end up with 1,000,000, okay, little things in there. So instead of realizing they have a limited ray to work with to start with, they're saying, I'll compress it, and as I compress it, I'm not going to pay attention to time in any strict sense, you know, ray length, and I'm going to be able to take something that should only be this big a ray, right, because I've compressed everything, and they're just going to add all this extra energy to it. And this isn't real energy. It's not made out of anything real. It doesn't exist as a reality, all this extra energy they're giving it, because they're trying to convert something that has a limited length into something that has an infinite length. You know, the length, the amount of nodes in here can be infinitely increased just by putting the bits closer, just making the frequency higher. They can just, you know, the wavelength shorter and shorter, and they have this infinite well that they're essentially creating energy out of, and it's not it's not right. That's not the right answer, in my opinion. Clearly. Boo. Camera glitch thing. Anyway, almost done.
But we get the wavelength of the X-ray radiation that's produced in one of these X-ray machines. So that's 6.626 e to the 19 minus times 3 e to the 8 divided by 59,300 and divided by 1.6 e to the 19 minus. And we have a wavelength of 20.95 nanometers. So just about 21 nanometers wavelength of X-ray radiation that we use for medical purposes when the target is, in this case, it would be tungsten. Notice our molybdenum, we have an energy of about a third, a little bit less than a third, so we have wavelengths of probably around 70 or so nanometers when we use this kind of X-ray machine. Again, here's an interesting concept.
Right, not that much, you know, not dramatically higher, so the band for what is called X-rays is pretty small, and then you jump into gamma rays, and then you end up with another almost infinite well. They can make a gamma ray anything from, you know, 1 nanometer to, picometer and secometer and, you know, whatever, Google meter. You know, they can just keep making it smaller and smaller and smaller and piling more and more energy into it as if it would matter. Once you have enough energy to tip it, you have enough energy to tip it. So the argument would be, is like if you're trying to tip something over and you need to use speed because it's going to wobble. So the faster, so you need to hit it before it can rebound. That's what you're after. You're not really letting it wobble and then hit it. But that also can be the case where, you know, you, like a pendulum, you keep poking it when it's moving in the but you're adding energy or pushing a swing. But
but I would argue that it's more basic than that, in the sense that all you want to do is hit it before it rebounds. So you're just pushing it further and further away until it's magnetically no longer connected to the atom. So and so once you've done that, once you're fast enough to do that, you're fast enough to do that. It doesn't make much difference anymore. You will add more momentum the faster you go, but the amount of momentum you add is much less as a percentage. It gets less and less and less, because all you're really doing is it rebounds a little tiny bit, each time. So the faster you go, the less it can rebound. That means the further or more momentum you can give it in one direction, because it never rebounds. But it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. It gets harder and harder to add more energy the higher you go. And they end up with these photons that end up with preposterous amounts of energy, merely because they are pretending that it matters to the atom somehow, and it can't matter. Once you've kicked the electron out, it's kicked out. And yes, you can kick it out with a little bit more velocity, but you can't kick it out with a insane amount of velocity, and they keep giving things insane amounts of velocity.
How do we produce these particular X-rays? We have electrons that then are targeting an anode. They collide, they're deflected and collide with the atoms inside the target. That sudden deceleration of these electrons cause either a deflection, which causes the Bremsstrahlung radiation to occur, which is a form of X-rays, low intensity X-rays, or we have
So there's basically just, again, the argument is that somehow this bending that can't change momentum, theoretically. It just can't. It can't create a real drag, unless you're actually moving the proton. But anyway.
Electrons knocking other electrons out of place, other electrons falling down into this level, and then releasing the energy difference right here. And that's why we have these very true peaks, these high peaks of radiation that we use in our X-ray machines.
So again, I would agree that the high peaks are evidence of the material you're hitting, and it's evidence of the pressure that already exists inside the atom, and that's the preferential pressure you're releasing. And yes, you can create other kinds of pressure by pushing into the system. You can make more or less, and more likely less. But anyway.
Another look of how photons work, in this case, in the case of production of X-rays.
Okay. So, yeah, that's probably enough subjects. So again, it's once the real answer is really known, I mean, again, it's not that complicated. What's happening is just some mechanical process. All right, it's just identifying the process. But I think in their context, first not recognizing how big photons are in terms of how big their spread over space is, that they land on a surface, they're affecting thousands of atoms. They're affecting an area that covers thousands of atoms. They obviously can only affect for how many nodes they have. It's the nodes are being spread over different locations. So a little piece of the photon is landing in different locations, and clearly the photon has to be rebuilt. Whether it's a reflection or a transmission, the photon's going to be rebuilt again. And it's just the consistency of the material is telling you whether it's can rebuild it in a way that's coherent, that an image could go through. But anyway, so their story is far from complete. I would argue that yes, mine's not complete either, but it's more complete. It covers more of the subject than theirs does, with a model that's clearly more mechanical than theirs is. You can't hit something that doesn't have any spatial volume. It's just kind of silly to even talk about it, frankly. But anyway, there's just a lot of flaws in what they're saying. And they're just asserting it with such confidence, like this is the right answer, when it's obviously a very incomplete answer. And such.